Hi, everyone. I think we are live. Welcome as people are coming into the webinar. We're so excited to have this conversation today, this cross-partisan dialogue on sustainable finance. We will start in just one moment. We'll let people continue to join in. We have well over 150 registrants today from across the country to join in this important conversation and wonderful panelists. So we're very, very excited. Well, welcome again to everyone for this conversation about sustainable finance policy in Canada. Have distinguished speakers and policymakers joining from across the political parties, as well as from the House of Commons and Senate today. Some real leaders on moving forward policy in Canada that aligns our sustainable Zoom housekeeping that you all need to know about. So first of all, I would like to thank our colleagues from Cop2Com, who you will notice in the chat, who are going to help make this bilingual. So bonjour tout le monde, bienvenue. La conversation serait premièrement en anglais, mais on va faire le flexibilité de inviter les participants de parler en leur langue préférée et vous aussi par audience. What we are going to do is invite all of our speakers to speak in their preferred language and have our wonderful colleagues from Cop2Com doing some key message translation in the chat so that all of these brilliant speakers can be understood by the full audience about the important messages they're sharing. That's one point for bilingual. A second piece is that we invite all of you throughout the conversation to use the Q&A box to add your questions to the chat. We'll have significant space at the end for that question and answer from you. So please feel free to share that in your preferred language, and I will do the navigation of making sure all of our speakers can answer that as well. Lastly, for bilingualism, we're going to share both the recording of this event as well as a blog post highlighting the key messages that have come out of this conversation, and that will be in both Canadian official languages of English and French as well. So merci for that, and to all of our colleagues who are supporting to make that happen. I'll also note some of the partners behind the scenes here who have organized this webinar. This is being hosted by us from Environmental Defence, Canada Climate Law Initiative, who I'm sure you all know well is an amazing sustainable finance and climate finance policy group and legal group, as well as supported by the Trottier Foundation and Cop2Com, of course, with all of our communications and translation support. As mentioned, over the next hour, we're going to be discussing why climate finance is such, and actually I think I've short sold us. I believe we have 75 minutes together. Over the next bit, we're going to be discussing why climate finance policy is such an important and stimulating conversation for us to all be having, which you all obviously know as spending your lunch hour or morning hour with us. We're going to be talking about why it's important to align the financial system with climate action. Just recently, a report has come out showing Canadian banks, for example, are some of the largest financiers of fossil fuels, the largest contributor to the climate crisis. We're punching above our weight in a bad way in Canada when it comes to
J'entends plus rien. Down here. Down here. N'entends pas. Turn on and turn off your microphone.
Are people able to hear me? That was such a brilliant, easy solution. Thank you, Senator Galvez, for the forever winning solution of turn it on and off again. So apologies, everybody, for that, and maybe I'll jump into the questions soon. Essentially, Canada is behind the 8 ball when it comes to setting policy for sustainable finance. but that is not because of a lack of effort from the wonderful people on this call. So we're going to be hearing about what they are all doing and what the parties that they're affiliated with and the institutions they're affiliated with are doing to push forward. And I think a really important part of this is as we're, coming up to the end of a government cycle with an election, at the latest next fall. So that will be a really relevant part of the conversation, and we look forward to your questions. Before we jump into that, I'll take a moment to recognize the land that I'm currently on, and of course invite speakers to do the same. I am on the traditional territories, what's currently known as Toronto, but is the traditional and historical territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat people. And I mean, it's so critical for us to recognize the history of the country that we're living in as we're discussing the current government institutions and what we're doing to move towards a system that is less harmful to the land and the planet and the people and other forms of nature that we're on. Recognizing the history of Canada, being founded in a way that has changed the relationship of peoples who had very close relationship to land for time immemorial, and thinking about how we can learn from that is, both recognize it but also learn from it is such a key important of any key piece of any conversation that we're having on policy in Canada today. So with that, I will introduce our wonderful speakers and start on our questions. First, we have the independent senator from Quebec, Rosa Galvez, who introduced the Climate Aligned Finance Act in the Senate, one of the most brilliant, globally leading bills, which we'll talk more about when we come to Senator Galvez's questions. We have Member of Parliament Ryan Turnbull, who is also who's a Liberal Member of Parliament for Whitby, as well as the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry, and as well Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance and Deputy Prime Minister. So that was that caused me to take a breath, Ryan, and congratulations for the recent new role with the Minister of Finance. We have Députée Monique Pesé avec le Bloc québécois, qui est le membre de Parlement pour Repentigny, Québec. Bienvenue, Monique, Madame Députée Pesé. And we also have Member of Parliament Laurel Collins, who is joining us from the New Democratic Party and has done great work as the critic for environment from the New Democratic Party. So welcome, MP Collins. And we will also be joined by the party leader of the Green Party and Member of Parliament, Elizabeth May. She's planned to join us today, and hopefully she'll be joining us very, very soon. We'll start with a chance for everyone to set the scene, and you'll have to forgive me for inviting you to be brief for this first question, but we'll have plenty of time to dive into the specificities of the great work that you've been leading on this file. We're just starting this as a warm-up so that we get to hear from all of you a brief intro to some of the work you've been leading, and to really set the scene for our audience on always why is this conversation so important. So to each of you, and I'll point to you each in order, why do you think that this intersection of climate, finance, and policy is so important? We'll start with you for a quick answer, Senator Galvez.
Merci beaucoup, Julie. Okay, so very quickly. So since the 90s, we are trying to transition. This is not anymore a transition, this is a transformation because we have waited very long. There has been 10 climate action plans, not only from this government, but from the previous government. So that tells us that something is not going right. Last reports, as you mentioned, shows that, well, Canada is now at the 67th position in the Climate Change Performance Index. Without the finance sector, we are not going to move. Nobody's moving without because they are the catalyzers. They are the one who provides the means for us to move from the fossil fuel to a transition to a low carbon economy. And the chances of having an orderly transition is going away because we are waiting too long. the regulators are saying they are waiting for signals from the government, and we are in a vicious circle. So unless we cut this vicious circle, we will still be in this position.
Merci, Senator Galvez. MP Collins, we'll go to you for a quick answer about why you think this intersection is so, so important.
Well, yeah, I think, like Senator Galvez said, we are in a climate emergency. This is, yeah, it's no longer optional. Climate action is not optional. We must take the kind of transformative action that is needed to address this crisis. And we know that financial institutions will not move voluntarily. Similarly, oil and gas companies are not going to change their behavior voluntarily. Their mandate is to maximize their profit. And so without strong financial regulations, these institutions, these companies are not going to change their behavior. And our banks, our pension funds, the insurance companies, they're often taking our money and heavily investing it in fossil fuels. It is the opposite of the approach that we need. And yeah, we need to really take on this short-term mentality of maximizing profit at the expense of a climate-safe future. So until the rules that govern these sectors, the financial institutions and the oil and gas sector, are changed, nothing is going to change.
Thank you, MP Collins. Absolutely, it's about changing and fixing the rules of the game for the current crisis. I'll take this chance to welcome MP Elizabeth May from the Green Party. Thanks so much for joining us. And I'll pose maybe this question to you next while introducing, we're just starting our first round of questions to everyone in a almost rapid fire kind of way. So we'll get more into the details later, but for now we're inviting about 60 seconds on the key question. Why do you think the intersection of climate, finance, and policy, all of those things wrapped into one, why is that important? A quick question from you, and thanks so much for joining us, MP May.
Just call me Elizabeth, and it's easier. And hello, Rosa and Laurel, Ryan. It's all good to see all of you. Monique, bonjour, ma chère collègue. Look, very quickly, we're on the edge of the destruction of human civilization. We're exhausting our carbon budget in real time and real science. We know what we have to do. And this country, through investment decisions, through our banks, through our pension funds, is still betting on success financially at the expense of human civilization's survival and the biosphere remaining habitable. So quickly, there's some places we should focus. I'd love to talk about what we need to do to take us towards sustainable finance. I'll flag one now that I'd like to dive into a bit more deeply. Obviously, Senator Galvez's bill needs to pass the Senate, get into the House. But we have an opening with the budget with a new group being headed by Stephen Paulos. Very little discussion on it yet, but on pension funds, we need immediate, urgent amendments to the Canadian to our Canada Pension Plan Investment Board Act. And we also, I'd love to touch on misunderstandings about the roles of directors under Canadian corporations. Under black letter law of this country, they are not restricted to returning best investment to shareholders. Our law has changed in this regard, but it's repeated as if it's true that their only thing that they do is by law returning profits to shareholders. That's not the case. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. And Elizabeth, you'll have to forgive me on a webinar for calling you MP May. I might keep it up. But thanks so much for that. And we'll get into all of those details, which I love that you started with further in the conversation. MP Turnbull, let's go over to you.
Well, for 30 or 40 years, climate scientists have been ringing the alarm bells about the climate emergency. From my perspective, being in the governing party, we've put forward a pretty comprehensive plan for addressing climate change. I know my colleagues will all say there's gaps, and there are. I'm perfectly willing to admit that, but I feel very confident that our government believes that we need to fight climate change with ever increasing urgency. I also believe that climate finance is one of the key missing pieces for us to achieve rapid decarbonization across the industry. And I think we have to step up and use the levers of the federal government in both finance and procurement, which I think are two massive levers that the federal government has. And they're two places where I think if we don't use those, we will not achieve our objectives. And so I've been an advocate for this since I got elected in 2019. So I'll leave it there, but look forward to lots more in-depth conversation.
Thank you so much for that. And now we'll go to MP Posé. MP Posé, pourquoi vous pensez que cette intersection entre les finances, le climat et la politique est aussi importante?
Alors, merci beaucoup. Merci de la question. Avant toute chose, j'aimerais souligner qu'il y a des hommes, il y a des femmes qui font un travail remarquable pour faire progresser le dossier de la finance durable. Et puis, je veux souligner particulièrement le travail de la sénatrice. Rosa Galvez, parce que le projet de loi qu'elle a déposé, nous autres, on est jaloux. C'est le projet de loi que le Bloc aurait voulu déposer. Et puisqu'on a un député qui porte ce dossier-là, la finance durable. Maintenant, pourquoi c'est important d'en parler? C'est que, vous savez, quand les acteurs économiques, ce qu'ils font, ils entreprennent des analyses reliées au changement climatique, eux autres, ils pensent à une chose, c'est les rendements financiers futurs. Alors que nous, on va le penser autrement. On va penser quels pourraient être les coûts environnementaux qui seraient reliés à faire du surplace. Alors, et c'est pour ça que c'est si important de relier tous ces aspects-là, si vous voulez, finance, environnement et politique, parce que faire du surplace, je veux dire, ça nous amène dans le mur. Moi, des fois, j'ai goût de dire qu'on y est déjà, là, dans le mur, mais voilà, c'est sous cet angle-là qu'on doit le voir. Ça serait quoi les coûts? Peu importe les rendements financiers, et ça, c'est pas nous autres, ça. Ça, c'est peut-être le comité des finances, mais le comité d'environnement, les gens qui sont préoccupés par l'environnement, c'est à ça qu'ils doivent s'attaquer.
Merci beaucoup, Monique Posé, et merci aussi pour la célébration de la sénatrice Rosa Galvez avec le Climate Aligned Finance Act. And a reminder to everyone that you're welcome to look through the chat as we have wonderful support from colleagues. You'll notice Stefan's drill posting non-verbatim but highlights direct translation as we go. So thanks so much, everyone, for setting the scene there. I often find when I combine the words regulation, finance, and climate all in one sentence, people's eyes sometimes glaze over until they realize how powerful this intersection in this tool is, right? Finance shapes the world that we live in today and tomorrow, and we have rules of the game for a reason to make sure that's working in the best interest of people. As the climate crisis escalates, this is such an important piece that I'm so glad to be discussing with you all. So MP Turnbull, let's go back to you. It would be great to hear a bit more about Motion 84. A year ago, you introduced this motion into the House of Commons, which talked about using all of Canada's regulatory and legislative tools to align our financial system with climate action. As you mentioned in your opening remarks, you said that as a member of the governing party, there's a plan on climate. There are gaps to that. There are pieces that need to be strengthened. And I think what I've heard from just about everyone here is climate finance policy is the missing piece, or a huge missing piece of that climate plan. The ideas behind and the spirit behind Motion 84 was really quite wonderful in saying, let's use every tool to align finance with our existing commitments on climate change. And all members of party from this call endorsed and supported that motion, which was wonderful to see this cross-partisan support. So can you explain a bit about why this tool of a motion 84 was important? Talk a bit about the cross-partisan support and how we can move forward on this, and what do you think is next steps to make this happen? we'll invite you to start with that.
Thanks, Julie. Great question. And it was a great pleasure to introduce or table motion 84 in the House. I'm sort of somewhat disappointed that we didn't get to actually debate it. I didn't get to move it in the House, but that's because they made me a parliamentary secretary, which I consider a blessing in disguise, because now I get to work on these issues both in ISED and in finance, which I think is great. But motion 84 is a fairly simply worded motion that says, let's, as you said, use all regulatory and legislative tools to align our financial system with our climate goals, and to do so in accordance with the Paris Agreement targets. I think that is a significant, general statement that I thought that most individuals that are serious about fighting climate change, and we saw the cross-party support, is very strong. So that's very encouraging. I would note we're already moving forward on some aspects of what I consider to be key climate-aligned policies in this area. The government committed after the last Sustainable Finance Forum in the fall economic statement, to move forward on both the green and transition taxonomy and mandatory climate-related disclosures, both of which I am currently working on. And I'm very excited to see progress made on both of those fronts. I will also note that recently I was in the committee on Bill C-59, which was the fall economic statement, where we strengthened the Competition Act, and there was significant collaboration on strengthening the part that deals with greenwashing on behalf of both the NDP, the Liberals. I know the Green Party, one of the Green Party members was there, not as a permanent member, but I know he would have been in support, as well as the Bloc. So there was really good, strong support for working together. And I think we strengthened the provision in the Competition Act around greenwashing, essentially to prevent greenwashing. So that's positive. That's not necessarily a climate finance policy, but it certainly will help when you think about how some institutions may be misrepresenting financial products and calling them green when maybe they're not. So I think the taxonomy will also help provide more credibility for financial products in the future. There's lots of I think good recommendations which came out of the Sustainable Finance Action Council's work that the government has taken up. Certainly, I think most of us would say from outside of government, what is taking so long? We need this to move forward urgently. I completely agree. I'm inside of government and I'm pushing every single day. There's not a week that goes by that I'm not working on that conversation and trying to move these two items forward. And I will say, it's always easy to criticize when you're not the one making the decisions. When you're internal to government, it tends to be a little more complex than you initially thought. So it takes a bit of time, but we are going to get there. And I know there's other climate-aligned financial policies that we can talk about other than those two, but I consider both mandatory disclosures and the taxonomy as being the two key ones that will enable capital flows, greater transparency in the market, more credibility, will give investors more confidence, will give Canadians more confidence in financial products that are calling themselves green or transition. And I will say that some of these things will be phased in over time, in my view, just as other jurisdictions have done, like the UK and the EU. So I feel encouraged by that. I feel encouraged by the cross-partisan support for a lot of these efforts, and I hope that parties will work with us when we get to a stage where we can start to release more details on these two key climate-aligned financial policies. And I hope that we'll get everyone's support for that. So I'll leave it there. But motion 84 still sits as a tabled motion in the House. I think to me, it's a great opportunity to discuss and have engaged dialogue across parties on the importance, just as Senator Galvez's bill in the Senate encourages us to start to have these debates and conversations, and that raises public awareness. It gets parties engaged in these really important debates. And I couldn't be more passionate about debating those things with my colleagues, especially when it's done in good faith, when we're all trying to achieve the same goal, which is to save our planet and ensure that we have a sustainable future for our kids and grandkids. I couldn't be more committed to that. So I thank everyone for their thoughts, opinions, and even their criticisms, because your critiques can help us as well be self-critical. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that. That's super, as well as how you tied in some of the key pieces active right now, essentially clearing up greenwashing, making sure that when companies say they're going to do something green, they're doing it. They're not just spending their efforts on marketing. For those who aren't familiar with the concept of a taxonomy, it's essentially a green classification system that would say this is a sustainable investment. This one, by not being included, isn't, and that helps clear up some of the claims companies or financial institutions might be making to make sure they're really credibly green. And similarly, disclosure of how they're doing on their climate plans. Almost every financial institution in Canada has a climate target to reduce emissions. Most of them don't have plans, or credible ones for sure. So thanks so much for highlighting some of those key policies. And I think we'll be getting into some of those in more detail. Next up, let's go to you, Senator Galvez. You introduced the Climate Aligned Finance Act into the Senate 2 years ago on March 24th, 2022. This year on March 24th, to celebrate the bill, global experts came together to talk about why this is such an impressive world-leading policy for a stable financial system and for a financial system that stops hurting the planet and actually works in line with it. Despite this huge support and cross-party backing, it hasn't yet been implemented. Let's hear a bit from you about how you see the Climate Aligned Finance Act, CAFA, is so important, what you think how you think this relates to some of the work happening by these other policymakers, and what should be done by these other policymakers and your colleagues in the next 3 months, 6 months, year to advance Climate Aligned Finance Act. So over to you to tackle that.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. There is a lot to unpack there. I will try to be brief. First, let me share my frustration with you. So while, it's in the committee and the bill is there, and while I'm bringing high caliber witness such as the director of the United Nations Sustainable Finance, academics with great expertise, and Mark Carney is there, in parallel to that, you have to listen to climate change deniers. This is like drive myself a little bit crazy. It has created me a little bit of acidity, because it's difficult to accept that today in 2024 we have. I completely agree with Ryan that we need to be constructive. We need to be, everybody in the academic world, we accept critics, because if there is no critic, if there is no different visions, you cannot progress. So we accept, we welcome this. But when the debate is like shut down and okay, let's even ignore the thing, let's do it's really frustrating. But on the positive side is that the study is progressing, and I'm managing to push. So like there are people with high caliber that come and explain the Institute of Bureau of Losses that tell us how much is costing extreme weather events came, and they were so clear, and despite of their clarity of the cost, which is only 1/3 of the total cost of these extreme weather events, provinces are footing some, and the municipalities are footing the rest, and this is not counting all the trauma that remains in these places where extreme weather events happen. So we are progressing. we hopefully are educating everybody. I found a lot of heterogeneity in the members of the committee in the banking, with people really not knowing nothing and people really knowing a lot. So I think that we have to level the playing field so everybody is in the same page. So my expectations in the positive way has been overcome. Initially, when we put the white paper, when we put the bill, was to raise awareness, and this is being done, and I'm very happy for the support from the House of Commons, the petitions, but also Envy is now doing a study on, merci Monique, il y a une étude qui est en train de se faire dans les comités d'environnement, dont je suis vraiment remercie beaucoup les membres d'avoir choisi ce sujet pour faire en sorte que tout le monde, dans les deux chambres, on devient de plus en plus conscient de la situation, de la urgence à agir. Il y a un lien, pas seulement avec les coûts de la non-action, mais il y a aussi un lien extrêmement important avec la compétitivité au Canada. Si nous n'avançons pas, il y a beaucoup de marchés qui vont être fermés aux investissements parce que nous avançons très lentement. Et d'autre part, nous allons faire un peu peur à les investisseurs d'ailleurs et nous allons pas promouvoir l'investissement ici même local parce qu'on continue avec les business as usual.
Merci. Thank you so much, Senator Galvez, for that. And it's also so helpful to understand some of what's happening behind the scenes in the Senate, which is, I think, an institution that people across Canada don't know the innards of quite as well. So that was really helpful to hear from you what's been going on with the Climate Aligned Finance Act, as you've been trying for so long just to get a fair conversation and a study on this bill, both to discuss, how do we implement these policies, these policy proposals, and to just generate a discussion about the essential need to address the economic damages from climate change and to ensure our financial system shifts to align with our existing climate commitments under the Paris Agreement and Canada's net zero emissions accountability promises. So thank you so much for all of those details. As well, we have from colleagues, thanks so much to Sonia Lee. We're sharing some of the links from CAFA and Motion 84 for you to understand a bit more about that after the webinar. So thanks everyone for that. And I'll also take this interlude to invite more questions from you in the chat. We've heard wonderful things from our panelists so far, and I bet that's sparking questions for all of you. So please feel free to use the Q&A function because we'll save lots of times for your questions as we're together until 1:15 Eastern. So next, we'll go to you, MP May. You and the Green Party have supported these motions and bills, and it's been really super to see, the Green Party's advocacy throughout its life for stronger climate action and environmental action in Canada, and recently specifically on climate aligned finance policy in general. So to what extent is...
Oups, on n'entend plus.
Yeah, we lost you there. Can you hear? Julie, we can't hear you.
How about now?
Oui, c'est revenu.
Okay, wonderful. I suppose as everyone has to say, it wouldn't be a Monday without tech issues. So thanks to Zoom for sponsoring that. I'll start the question over. MP May, great to hear from you as, climate and environment is a key part of your party's, priorities. To what extent is financial policy a key part of that vision when it comes to climate action? And if you can provide some insight into some of the policies you believe are necessary to accelerate Canada aligning its financial system with strong climate commitments.
I live in a dream world where Canada could be a climate leader globally. I believe it's still possible. I want to see it. And I think that means we also have to use a global lens. One of the things that I love about, you mentioned the Green Party, is le Parti vert, c'est un parti mondial. J'ai les collègues élus dans plusieurs pays du monde. So when I look around the world, we are a global party, and a lot of the policies that I've been advocating and with our Minister of Finance is that Canada should take the lead at what we really need at this juncture. We're in a what one might call a hinge moment in history. We're post-pandemic. We're losing our grip on what we thought was remember the days when we believed there was something called the end of history? We have a ground war now in Europe. We have post-pandemic dysfunction. We have extreme gaps between the richest and the poorest. The billionaire class is out of control in their greed. So let's just back up for a minute and say what I would believe Canada should do to start any claim of global leadership on climate is to follow the leaders and help them, because we're a G7 country. The leader, for instance, Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, working closely with former senior economist to World Bank and, of course, to the government of the UK, Nicholas Stern. We need to reconceptualize global financial rules in the same sweeping, transformative way that the Bretton Woods Conference reorganized the global economic system post-war. We need a new Bretton Woods in which we follow, again, what are we doing with financing? What are we doing with climate? So, for instance, at COP28, Mia Mottley, as I said, Prime Minister of Barbados, who's one of the most outstanding global voices around these restructuring questions, and Nick Stern, both endorsed a number of ideas that I think Canada we could do it. We could actually take the lead and push it forward on a G7 agenda to create global carbon pricing on the missing pieces of the Paris Agreement. International aviation and international shipping. If the emissions from shipping and aviation were a country, it would be the 7th biggest emitter on the planet. Apply carbon taxes to global aviation, global shipping, direct those funds to assisting developing countries in shifting to clean energy and in adaptation and resilience to climate events we can no longer avoid, for which we are criminally culpable as a nation. Say that again. Our leadership, our country is, I believe, criminally culpable for the impending death of millions of people because we signed a commitment in 1992 to reduce our emissions, and we've allowed them to go up steadily since then. We have a moral obligation to do more than what we're doing. So if we start restructuring global financial flows to ensure that the poorest of the poor are protected in climate emergencies to the extent possible, and that we also start seriously reducing our emissions, which means we have to consciously and out loud say we're shutting down the oil and gas industry in Canada. We don't have to do it overnight, but that's the goal, and there's an end point. We duck around this and pretend that's not critical, but it's critical. So I know I'll keep my remarks to that only for now, but those are our positions as a political party. We need to fix our financial flows in Canada to make sure that our financial rules and our investment rules are aligned with survival. And we really have a golden opportunity to do more globally in restructuring the global economic system. I'll just make one last point. We can't do anything about reorganizing atmospheric physics, atmospheric chemistry. They have their own rules, and we can't reshape them. We can reshape global economic rules. We can put the IMF in charge of collecting carbon taxes from global aviation and international shipping. And we can follow the advice, again, the champions on this, Mia Mottley, Nick Stern, ask them what we should do and make us the country that takes that forward to the world.
Thank you so much, MP May, and I really appreciate you highlighting the obvious role of the fossil fuel companies in this problem. Canadian banks, pension funds, insurers remain overexposed to fossil fuels, underexposed to clean energy. And that just creates, that overlap creates such a regrettable and dangerous status quo bias, which we need to tackle by fixing the rules of the game here. So I'll move to you now, MP Collins. The NDP has supported these policy proposals, Motion 84, Climate Aligned Finance Act, and has even taken various actions on your own accord, including coming out with a statement against a proposed merger of two large banks, HSBC and RBC, highlighting both affordability and climate concerns from that combination of financial institutions. So this is an area that you and your party have certainly been working on. It'd be great to hear from you. To what extent is financial policy a core part of the New Democratic Party's vision when it comes to upcoming policies, and particularly on climate? And what policies do you think are critical?
Yeah, thanks so much, Julie. And I think this is a core piece of the action that we need to take. And during the last election, it was a central piece of our platform. We made commitments to reviewing and updating financial legislation, including the Bank of Canada Act, Export Development Canada Act, the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board Act. And we, have continued to push to have all these financial levers ensure that our government, our crown corporations, the institutions that we govern are going to be aligned with the goal of a climate safe future. And so, we also have been pushing the government to work with the provinces to ensure that there's a framework for corporate climate accountability, ensuring that we have transparency when it comes to carbon risk, and ensuring that we have really strict rules to prevent big companies from using the purchase of offsets as a way to escape the obligations we have to our climate commitments. But I do want to quickly touch, there's a question in the Q&A, which I think also has really profound relevance to our conversation and is central to the New Democrat push to tackle this issue. And it's really that we can't continue to go down the path that we've seen consecutive Liberal and conservative governments go down, which is to spend money, our public money, on oil and gas subsidies. And the federal government has been spending billions of dollars each year to support the expansion, the exploration, the production, refining, transportation of oil and gas in our country. And not to mention the fact that the government bought an oil pipeline that is now costing taxpayers $35 billion. We have to ensure that our public funds are going towards the transition, going towards renewable energy, going towards low carbon, on a low carbon economy. And right now, billions of our taxpayer dollars are going to support profitable oil and gas companies. And we've seen the government make some moves in this area, and in large part because we've been pushing them. And we have kind of two models. One is the government tackled international fossil fuel subsidies, and this was last fall. We pushed to have a really strong framework, and while it's not perfect, there is strength in that. Unfortunately, in the spring, then the government came out with a domestic policy that has so many loopholes. It's so disappointing. And we're about to go into a time when we are pushing them to tackle public financing through Export Development Canada. This is some of the biggest fossil fuel subsidies. And we have kind of two pathways before us, and we need to make sure that we have a strong framework, that we actually phase out these fossil fuel subsidies. And I think CCUS is a big part of that. And this government has doubled down on handing over billions of dollars to profitable oil and gas companies to do things that those companies should be doing themselves. They should be paying for, and that we should have regulations in place that force them to do that, and strengthening our industrial carbon pricing to make sure the biggest emitters, those big oil and gas companies, are forced to reduce their emissions is essential in that.
Thank you so much, MP Collins, and I appreciate you highlighting the connection between public policy and private finance, as well as public finance and private finance. And how, what our banks, pension funds, and insurance companies are investing in, is related to some of the market incentives that are created by subsidies, right? That, subsidizing oil, gas, and coal investments from the public side certainly change the return profile of those investments in a way that influences private financial decisions. So it is all certainly quite related. Maintenant, pour député Posé, merci beaucoup pour votre patience avec les autres panélistes. Je sais pas en français l'expression de last but not least, mais celui-ci est tellement accurate ici. Donc, vous et le Bloc québécois avez soutenu le projet de loi de sénatrice Galvez et aussi leur motion 84 très tôt. Comment envisagez-vous la politique financière climatique dans le cadre de la vision de la Bloc? Et aussi, comment est-ce que le secteur de la finance durable de Québec, qui est sans doute plus avancé en beaucoup de façons, éclaire-t-il votre point de vue?
Je vous remercie. L'avantage ou le désavantage de passer en dernier, c'est que je voudrais parler de tout ce que le monde a dit. Je voudrais peut-être, je tiens quand même à ramener tout de suite une chose qui a été dite dès le départ par M. Turnbull quand il a parlé de taxonomie. Ça va rejoindre ce que d'autres collègues ont dit, c'est qu'actuellement, au comité, ce qu'on voit, c'est que, on a eu une première rencontre sur la motion que le Bloc a amenée, mais si la taxonomie puis les cadres réglementaires puis législatifs sont déterminés par des acteurs qui continuent d'émettre des émissions, on fait quoi? Et je vous donne un exemple. Dans le fameux groupe d'experts que le gouvernement avait mis sur pied, bien, le rapport de ce groupe d'experts sur la finance durable, la recommandation 12, est dit construire des oléoducs d'exportation. Et parce que lui, monsieur, le président, le directeur de la banque qui était là, la RBC, qui est celle qui en donne le plus aux oléoducs, fait des liens entre les règles de la finance durable et des projets spécifiques. Alors, comment peut-on relier la construction d'un oléoduc à un rapport sur la finance durable? Alors, et ce que je veux dénoncer, c'est que ce que le gouvernement fait actuellement sur la taxonomie, mais c'est qu'autour de la table, ce sont des gens, il y a des gens, en tout cas, des pétrolières qui sont là. Alors, si c'est eux autres qui règlent, qui font les règles, les définitions de la taxonomie, écoutez, on n'est pas sorti du bois, là, hein? Puis ici, tout le monde s'entend pour dire que les finances puis leurs décisions au système financier, leurs orientations, ça devrait être vis-à-vis de la société puis vis-à-vis de la planète au grand complet. Alors, ceci dit, oui, ce qui se passe au Québec, actuellement, alors on a déjà beaucoup de fonds d'investissement qui offrent des produits de placement qui sont alignés sur les objectifs de l'accord de Paris. Par exemple, on a notre Banque nationale d'investissement, Bâtirante, le CDPQ, là, la Caisse de dépôt et placement du Québec. On a bien sûr les caisses Desjardins. On a Fonds d'action et le Fonds de solidarité. Je tiens à ces deux-là parce que je suis issue du monde syndical. Donc, ça, ce sont deux fonds de deux grandes centrales syndicales qui existent depuis fort longtemps puis qui ont été, je dirais, des précurseurs dans le domaine en offrant déjà des produits basés sur le ESG, environnement, social et gouvernance. Maintenant, il y a eu aussi des initiatives plus récentes au Québec. Finance Montréal, par exemple, qui a mis sur pied un programme spécifique puis ciblé pour nos petites et moyennes entreprises. Il y a eu aussi la création d'une chaire de recherche en finance durable à HEC Montréal, Hautes études de Montréal. Et cette chaire de recherche sur la finance durable, c'est vraiment là, ce qui est le moteur de tout ça. Et qu'est-ce que ça a donné comme résultat? Eh bien, oui, le gouvernement, évidemment, a son plan d'action de développement durable 2023-2028 au ministère des Finances du Québec. Et ça parle entre autres des actions à prendre afin d'accélérer la portée de la finance durable, mais aussi c'est le cœur de Montréal est devenu un des principaux bureaux du Conseil des normes internationales d'information sur la durabilité. Alors, chaque année, Montréal donc reçoit plusieurs rencontres de décideurs qui créent des normes, qui lancent leur mise en place pour permettre aux entreprises de fournir au marché financier des informations stratégiques sur leur impact environnemental. Alors, je pense que Montréal a été un leadership en finances durables très clair. Mon 4 minutes est passé. J'aurais tant à dire, mais je m'arrête pour laisser de l'espace aux questions et réponses. Merci.
Parfait, merci beaucoup, député Posé, c'était parfait. Et je veux ajouter aussi, avec toutes vos références, that this is such a great moment to highlight a partner of ours for this webinar, Finance Montréal, who's having a Sommet Finance Durable in person as well as virtual events such as this one, hosted throughout the week. And hope that many of you in the audience will be joining us in person for the rest of the Sommet Finance Durable in Montreal in the coming days. And one thing that I'd like to highlight, which is something I've been saying we need for Canada for quite some time, le Québec dispose actuellement un comité consultatif, so Quebec now has an advisory committee pour une feuille de route pour les finances durables, for a roadmap to a sustainable finance system focused on, not just, not the economic resiliency necessarily, but what do we need for climate action? Une committee que je suis très heureux d'être un membre. I'm very delighted to be a member of that committee, and I think Canada has a lot to learn from the steps ahead that Quebec have been taking to align the financial system with climate action. We'll now move to some of the audience questions, which are coming in fast near the end of the webinar. So thanks to all of you in the audience for sharing your thoughts and reflections. And you'll hopefully I'll do a wonderful job of summarizing some of these so that we can get to as many as possible. And you'll all have to forgive me as audience members for hybridizing those. How we're going to tackle this, I'm going to share the questions in English and French for our speakers and open it to each of you, as we don't yet have anything addressed specifically. We have about let's say 15 minutes left to discuss those. So for this round as well, I'll invite you to be brief, or to put it more positively, punchy in your answers here. Without further delay, let's go into some of those next questions. Le rapport de Banking on Climate Chaos, and don't worry, I'll do this in English next, vient d'être publié récemment et souligne une fois de plus que les banques canadiennes sont parmi les plus grands bailleurs de fonds de combustibles fossiles dans le monde. Que pensez-vous les risques pour l'économie canadienne, comme les actifs échoués et la compétitivité, si nos banques sont les bailleurs de fonds de dernier recours pour les combustibles fossiles? So, to all of you here, a recent report which comes out annually, Banking on Climate Chaos, highlighted once again very recently that Canadian banks remain some of the largest funders in fossil fuels globally. What do you think about the economic risks for Canada, including sort of stranded assets, loss of competitiveness, if Canadian banks continue to essentially be a lender of last resort for fossil fuels? Opening that to all of you to jump into with quick answers around the board. We'll start with you, Senator Galvez, and then MP Main, inviting the rest as well.
Yes, thank you. It's very disappointing because instead of going, there are two indicators, for banks. How much they are investing in renewable energy, they should be investing in a ratio to 4:1, and it's exactly the opposite. They are investing 3.9 to 1. So they are very far from what is required. So they are not playing the role of catalyzers. But the question is why this is happening. One of the reasons I think is because when we see at the boards who sits in the boards, there is an overlapping between, board members in the in the oil companies and members in the banking boards and then members in the insurance and members in the pension plan. So if you are wearing multiple hats and you're taking these decisions or where to invest, this poses not only an appearance, but actually a potential and almost real conflict of interest. And we have to look at it because a petroleum company can have, as a profit at the short term, but the pension plan should be a long term. And the banks, the money is our money. I have my money in BMO, so it's my money. So I need to know where are they. And so it's a matter of transparency. We don't want them to have all their eggs in the same basket and increase the exposure because of all the physical risk, transition risk, reputational risk, litigation risks that are exponentially increasing.
Thank you so much, Senator Galvez, for all of that important data. Over to you, MP May, for some quick thoughts on this.
They're criminals. The fossil fuel industry globally is a form of organized crime, and we really need to stop pretending that they're responsible corporate citizens. I'm sorry. They have the science, they've known the science for decades, and they've lied about it, and they put themselves forward as somehow committed to net zero by 2050 itself, hanging out there without the IPCC science of what needs to be done by 2030 is itself fraud. I mentioned at the very opening that Canada's directors have responsibilities beyond responsibilities to their shareholders. This is black letter law. It was brought in Bill C-97. We have amended the Canada Business Corporations Act that the class of stakeholders to whom directors of all corporations in Canada have responsibilities includes the responsibility to climate, to that well-being of the whole country. So let's look at that and make sure we stop saying that the only responsibility of corporations is to enhance the profitability and returns on investments to shareholders. That's not true. It may be law in Delaware. It's not law in Canada. We need to start talking that up. We also need to say, look, just as Senator Galvez was saying, when our money is invested in fossil fuels, we're taking public funds and putting them in the pockets of the organized criminals who don't care about our survival as long as they can keep making money. So again, I started with this point. I want to drill it down. The Canadian Pension Plan Investment Board Act was set up under Jean Chrétien's government with a specific mandate to have only one concern as an investment board. And by the way, they're hands off with government. They're appointed. They sit people from the United States, from New York, bond traders, people who are looking at how to maximize the return on investment as the only concern they have. That's our public pension funds, all of us. And the only criterion is return on investment. That's why our Canada Pension Plan is heavily invested in PetSmart chain in the United States. They're not an evil bunch, but heck, why don't we make sure we amend the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board Act to ensure that the criterion is examined, or maybe several criteria, is benefit to the Canadian economy. Wow, there's a shocker. Support for Canadian infrastructure, support for Canadian climate action, support for the well-being of future generations. We have created an act which requires that our billions of dollars of public pension funds can be put in the hands of fossil fuel projects around the world. And there's nothing we can do about it because the board itself is following the law and its mandate. There are things we need to fix. And I think we have to start by stopping.
You'll have to sincerely forgive me
for
going to our next panelist, as I see those wonderful little Zoom hands coming up quickly. But thank you so much for all of that. Especially, I mean, what you've tied throughout that is a focus on long-term prosperity for people instead of just next quarter's profits, right? How do we think about what we actually need to deliver and change the rules to deliver that? So appreciate your comments on that. We'll go in the order of your hands up. Thanks so much, everybody.
Sorry, I'm not sure who's next.
Oh, forgive me. I assume that showed up on everyone's screens. MP Turnbull, we'll go with you, and then MP Posey and MP Collins. Thanks, everyone.
Great. So I agree with some of the comments said. Certainly, board governance is going to be an important consideration, and I think that point's already been made quite well. In my mind, there's, certainly, I think what we need to do is mobilize about 115 to 125 billion more dollars towards the climate finance and really move those dollars from one side that is overexposed to the risks that we're talking about, the quite real physical risks in a changing climate, which poses risk to customers and pension plan members, right? And I think we as Canadians, as members of CPP, should be demanding those changes. And I think we see more and more pressure building up. Certainly that could increase. I think what my focus is always on in terms of what we can do is create the enabling conditions for, I think, financial institutions to start shifting their decision making towards moving that capital from, overexposed investments to ones that are going to contribute significantly to the agenda to get to net zero. And I think that's what Senator Galvez is talking about. I would note that there is some movement afoot, like the B15 guidelines from OSFI requires financial institutions now to disclose their transition plan and manage climate risk. It is a guideline, but my understanding is financial institutions treat that as a requirement, and that is in place. I know that we're not necessarily seeing that yet, that behavioral shift, but I think as we move to put more pieces in the sort of enabling policy environment in place, I envision seeing that change. The behavioral change happens after you make the policy changes at a national level, and we need to see that change. So I think there's lots of different levers that different actors in our economy and our system can be using to put more and more pressure for us to shift those dollars, because that's really what it's about from an economic perspective. I think it's about reallocating those funds. Now, how does a bank and financial institution divest of major investments that they've made? And how do they do that responsibly? I think that's another question that often gets overlooked in these conversations. That's, that transition. How does that orderly transition take place? I agree with Elizabeth May saying we have to make it now. At the same time, we have to think about what are the implications and how quickly can we do that, and what are the levers that we have at our disposal. So I'm interested in those constructive sort of suggestions, and because it's not just pull the plug and everything is going to to sort of right size. It's got to actually be an orderly transition. So
Thanks,
we
MP
realize that with
Turmo.
like the Sustainable Jobs Act, right? And when we're
Apologies to
talking
you
about
as well. Apologies to you as well, MP Turmo.
no
I'm
problem.
just going to leave space for other panelists. And it sounds like we should have booked maybe a 6-hour conversation, but I think you all have
Yeah.
schedules as our speakers a bit too jam-packed for that. So forgive me. But MP Posey, MP Collins, over to you to talk a bit about what the risks are from Canadian banks being some of the largest funders of fossil fuels globally.
Oui, alors
Merci.
merci pour les questions. On voit que les gens s'impliquent, c'est intéressant. Je vais ramener ça un peu à la motion qui est discutée, qu'on a commencé à discuter parce qu'on va toucher justement au fonds de pension. La motion, ce qu'elle dit, qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire dans le fond, c'est qu'elle va dire qu'il faut que notre étude fasse une analyse des mécanismes qui sont à la disposition du gouvernement du Canada, mais qui vont permettre l'alignement de son régime financier avec l'accord de Paris. Alors, ce qu'on invite, on invite les gens des institutions bancaires et pour Élisabeth, on invite les gens aussi du fonds de pension qui sont sous juridiction fédérale. Alors, je retiens bien la suggestion de Mme May de dire qu'il faut effectivement amender le fonds de pension pour que les décisions et les orientations soient faites en fonction de la société et bien sûr de la planète. Moi, je vais profiter d'avoir la parole pour inviter les gens à s'intéresser à cette étude-là. bon, là, on a reçu le commissaire à l'environnement qui a fait un rapport il y a à peine un an, mais je vous dirais que les témoins aussi qui vont venir en comité lors de l'étude vont être des alliés pour nous. Puis ils vont contribuer à approfondir les réflexions des élus. Alors, que ce soit les organisations issues de la société civile ont un rôle important à jouer. Et notre rôle, le rôle de tous ces gens-là, c'est de mettre la pression sur le législateur pour qu'il légifère, justement. Alors, pour pas que ce soit, comme je disais tantôt, là, le groupe d'experts indépendants qui décide seul de la taxonomie. Non, non. C'est le législateur doit légiférer, puis le marché, il va s'ajuster. Alors, c'est comme ça qu'ils voient les choses en Angleterre. C'est comme ça qu'on devrait les voir ici aussi. Alors, je pense que les organisations comptent dans leur rang des experts du domaine juridique, économique, financier, des spécialistes des politiques publiques qui connaissent les rouages réglementaires, qui savent ce qui se fait ailleurs et desquels on pourrait s'inspirer. Alors, c'est ça le travail qui doit être fait. Euh, Peut-être par rapport à votre question, ce n'est pas une réponse directe, mais c'est en fonction du travail qui est fait de l'avant maintenant au comité, puis que j'invite les gens à suivre et à s'y intéresser, puis à participer également. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Over to you, MP Collins.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I think to the question, the risk is that we're allowing these companies, these institutions to continue business as usual. And business as usual, that path leads us to, what we've been seeing, increased natural disasters, forest fires, extreme flooding, heat domes that kill hundreds of people, droughts. These are going to cost the Canadian economy billions to respond to these disasters. And then there is the human cost. And we know that these disasters also disproportionately impact low-income folks, disproportionately impact racialized Indigenous communities. Someone asked in the comments about a guaranteed basic income and how that might relate to sustainable finance. Well, I think in the future that we are looking at, ensuring that we have income supports for folks, and especially the most vulnerable in our communities, is essential. Someone also asked about the who's in the way. And I would say that the current Minister of Finance, Chrystia Freeland, is in the way. Canada's green investment landscape is actually just a wild west of greenwashing, misleading so-called sustainable loans, billions of dollars used to bolster fossil fuel production. And so we need a strong taxonomy. And it looks like the government is heading down the road of labeling fossil fuels, LNG, as green under the new system. And I really hope that that's not the case. And I really hope that we are not going to bake in dangerous greenwashing into the economy, because we have seen that happen with CCUS. We have seen billions of our public dollars going towards profitable oil and gas companies. And so we're going to keep pushing. New Democrats are going to keep pushing to ensure that we don't label fossil fuels as sustainable investments, that we don't greenwash these kinds of investments. It's not enough to believe in climate change. It's not enough to believe in sustainable finance. We need to be taking the action, creating the strong regulations to transform our economic system and finances to a fairer and more sustainable future.
Thank you so much. Merci to each of you. Those were such amazing points. To Laurel, as you closed, there's so many economic costs. I think organizations estimate over half of GDP is expected to be lost 2025 due to climate damages, 300 billion in insurable losses over the past couple of years. And that does not cover the human and social and natural cost from climate change. To Deputy Posé's point, as you mentioned, there's a study going on right now in the Environment Committee about the financial impact on climate change. And someone put in the question about the importance of requiring bank CEOs and pension fund CEOs to testify at that as such an important piece of the conversation. So apologies we didn't get to that question, but covering it quickly. And many of you mentioned the need to really change the way our financial system is thinking about what their purpose is. And I'd point to the great work of Canada Climate Law Initiative in considering what the duty and requirements, the fiduciary duty and requirements of companies is when it comes to, actually considering climate change is very necessary. And we have literally 4 minutes left, so I'm going to have to invite people to give a super quick response to this. But in 30 seconds, I'll ask you about the point that MP Collins just closed on. Recently, over 50 climate organizations led by Environmental Defense sent a letter to government calling on it to not label fossil fuels as green under sustainable finance taxonomy. That has huge support from across climate expert organizations as well as beyond it. So just keen to hear, maybe, as that's such a live policy, I know most of our audience is thinking about the taxonomy right now, maybe 30 seconds around about what you think about some of the next steps on that piece there, opening that up for you to all step in on that quickly.
Oops.
Go for it. Thanks, MP Turnbull.
Yeah, I mean, taxonomy is so important. It's one of a number of key policy areas, but I don't agree that with folks that are saying that somehow the government is going to classify fossil fuels as green. That is not my understanding at all. So I don't think there's any risk of that. I will say that maybe just add the point that the government of Canada is working to implement blended finance to help move capital using public investment, and also has a pretty significant investment tax credit regime, which is clean hydrogen, clean electricity, the EV supply chain, the adoption of clean tech and clean tech manufacturing. All of those make a significant contribution in moving capital. Using public finance to help attract private capital is helpful in shifting in the direction that we need to go. And the taxonomy and disclosure conversation, I think, is another or two other enabling conditions so that we can have the uptake and the long-term, I think, the right conditions within the marketplace to ensure credibility and accountability and transparency. So to me, taxonomy is key. It's something, again, I'm pushing for. And I think in the grand scheme of things, it will develop as well. I think where the controversy lies often is around the transition label, and that will require additional evolution and science-based discussions around that. So thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That's great to hear. If you're saying you don't think there's concern on fossil fuels being classified as sustainable. Over to MP May, and then Senator Galvez, then MP Collins and MP Posey for your quick 30-second thoughts on that. And apologies for the brevity required.
No, believe me, we know how to pose questions in question period. They have to be 30 seconds. So brevity is a rule. But I think we need to name it, call it out. It started with the G7 summit back in 2021, where a text actually referred to natural gas among a list of renewable energy sources. It just sort of slipped in there. If fossil fuels include natural gas. Fracked natural gas, which is most of Canadian natural gas into LNG, has the same carbon footprint as coal over its life cycle because fracking releases an enormous amount of methane, just the nature of it. And we have massive greenwashing going on from the BC government, from the federal government, everywhere you look, and the LNG industry itself, claiming that it's somehow transitioning off fossil fuels when it is itself. It's fossil gas. Call it what it is, and we never should have on any list of green energy. We should also talk up what actually happened, by the way, at COP29, a commitment to triple renewable energy by 2030, a commitment to double energy efficiency by 2030, and which didn't get home all the way here from Dubai at COP28, we also committed to working towards a circular economy. So the economic financial measures are completely aligned with climate work. I'm going to stop there because I know that's more than 30 seconds.
Thank you, MP May, for highlighting the problem with what's called natural gas, methane gas. We actually have a report coming out on that later this week from Environmental Defense. Over to you, Senator Galvez.
So the International Energy Agency has been very clear. The oil that it's in the ground must stay in the ground. So, that means no new projects, no new pipelines. And the problem is that the disinvestment that is happening, the gap is being filled by our Canadian banks. So again, the risk is increasing. Everybody in the oil sector is in the race to be the last barrel to be sold, but we know that it's not the cleanest. So I hear some arguments, help us developing the carbon capture that is being in development for the last 40 years, and we will deliver the most cleaner, the most human right respected oil. But in reality, the one that is going to be the last one is the cheapest. It's not the cleanest, it's the cheapest. So I think that cost, because for these companies, the cost is so important, and for Canadians to stop financing the subsidies and these technologies that are maybe will be important for other sectors like the steel or the cement or concrete, but not necessarily for the oil and gas, because they've been developing this for the last 40 years and they haven't get much. So why is the public that needs to pay that?
Thank you so much, Senator Galvez. MP Collins.
Here, here. Want to echo those comments by Senator Galvez, and maybe just because I kind of touched on this in my last statement, I think it's important for us to talk about both the criteria for determining an activity that qualifies as green and also what qualifies as transitional. And I'm curious if the government has, settled on not labeling LNG as green, but is now going to label it as transitional. Anything that we're labeling as green or transitional should be science-based. It can't rely on unproven technologies. It can't further deepen our entrenchment in the investments in oil and gas. This taxonomy has to be strong. Transition activities, which for folks who are listening who might not know, sits between the green activities and those causing kind of the most significant harm to the environment. These need to be to ensure that we aren't actually labeling things that cause significant harm, which LNG does, as somehow transitional and on the journey towards Canadian environmental leadership. So yeah, I think it's really essential that we talk about both of these things and that we're listening to the experts, the civil society folks, environmental NGOs. They have been calling for us to take bold action, and we need to make that happen.
Thank you so much, MP Collins. And I often simply, will refer to this as the sustainable finance taxonomy, hybridizing those categories, because semantics does not matter, but science does matter, and scientific conclusions have shown us that we need to phase out fossil fuels. So thank you so much for that. Député Posé, à vous.
Oui, alors merci. Donc, juste, j'en ai parlé tantôt par rapport à la taxonomie. Je pense que je vais revenir là-dessus en disant que la semaine passée, au comité, on avait le directeur de la RBC, et on sait que c'est la banque qui finance le plus les industries fossiles. Et il faisait partie du groupe d'experts sur la finance durable, dont une des recommandations dit construire des oléoducs d'exportation. Alors, je ne l'ai pas inventé, c'est vraiment dans les recommandations du groupe d'experts. Alors, si ces gens-là sont autour de la table pour définir, pour faire les définitions, donc pour la taxonomie, je veux dire, on n'est pas sorti du bois, là. On va continuer dans les énergies fossiles. Et par rapport justement à l'éco-blanchiment, on a des données aussi qui nous disent que la moitié des incidents d'éco-blanchiment liés au climat, ça liait une institution financière à une société pétrolière et gazière. Alors, moi, je trouve que ça ne va pas très bien et je conclurai peut-être en disant que dans l'Union européenne, sur les rapports de durabilité des entreprises, ils exigent que les entreprises fassent état non seulement des risques du fait du changement climatique, mais aussi des impacts qu'elles ont sur les facteurs environnementaux et sociaux. Je pense que c'est
Mm.
une ligne que le Canada doit prendre et ce sera mon dernier mot.
Merci, merci beaucoup, Député Pesé. So I'll thank our audience members for your question as well as for joining us today. I think particularly some of the last questions from audience members generate a more fiery debate. So thank you so much to our audience members for spurring those, as well as to all of our speakers, who represent what really needs to happen in our government when individuals from across parties are willing to have what can sometimes be tougher conversations about difference of opinions or actions or pace, but all are, thinking about how do we push towards where we need to go of a more sustainable economic system, financial system, and safer climate. So thanks to all of you as our speakers so much for joining us today for this incredibly important conversation, for your work leading up to this that has given us rich pieces to talk about. And as well, knowing that we're moving into an election year with, 2025 end of the year as the latest point for the next Canadian election, for sharing what your priorities are as individuals and as the parties that you're working within to move forward for a more sustainable financial system and a climate-aligned one in Canada. Thanks to our audience members, thanks to all of our partners, and I'll remind you again about the Sommet Finance Durable pour le reste de la semaine en Montréal. Evidently, 75 minutes is not enough time for this important conversation, so thanks to Finance Montréal for hosting a whole week on it. See you all soon, and hope this conversation was great for you all.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Merci à vous.